Hello, friends. I'm John Ray, and along with my company, Business RadioX North Fulton, I'm the sponsor of this series, North Fulton Voices. And I just wanted to let you know that the interview we had with Kyle Wingfield was so insightful and so deep, actually, in some of the topics that we discussed, that we decided to leave the mics on and make it a two-part series. So this is part one of an interview with Kyle Wingfield of the Georgia Public Policy Foundation. Subscribe in your favorite podcast app, such as Apple, Spotify. We're on all the major apps. Subscribe now to make sure you don't miss part two of this insightful interview with Kyle Wingfield. Enjoy.
Broadcasting from the North Fulton studio of Business RadioX, it's time for North Fulton Voices. This show is brought to you by the North Fulton Improvement Network, addressing the workforce housing crisis in our region. Now, here are your hosts.
And welcome back to North Fulton Voices. I'm John Ray, and we are excited about today's show because we are talking about workforce housing from a public policy point of view. And today, from the North Fulton Improvement Network, to lead our discussion, Jack Murphy, Nancy Diamond. Jack, Nancy, welcome back.
Thanks again, John.
Good morning.
Great.
Thanks, John.
Yeah, great to have you here. And you've got data to frame our discussion, right, Jack?
Yes, we usually try to start with a little bit of information, but thanks everybody for joining us today. We're going to frame the conversation with a couple of data points. We consider middle-income housing to be affordable for people earning $50,000 to $90,000. There's a lot of discussion about what's affordable housing, and a lot of the facts get lost in the discussions and definition. So we've just put a stake in the ground and said $50,000 to $90,000 annual income is what we're looking for, because we're looking for housing that would allow teachers, nurses, public safety folks to live reasonably close to their North Fulton jobs. A first-year teacher this year in Fulton County schools started at $59,030, which puts that right at the lower end of that range we've talked about. It's a big jump from previous years, from certainly when my wife and kids started as teachers, but it's not able to keep up with the rising costs in housing. It would be difficult for a teacher to find an apartment here to live by him or herself. Nancy?
And in related information, that has translated into a decline in the middle income population in North Fulton. From 2020 to 22, the school years, there were a 54% increase in the number of student transfer records out of the county. That's 8,165 students in the 21-22 year alone. We believe that rising housing costs are a significant factor to this exodus. And from 2015 to 2020, there was a 9% increase in overall population. But when you look into that increase, that there was a 27% increase in households earning more than $75,000 a year. At the same time, households earning less than $75,000, which is the bulk of our workforce, has declined by 15%.
And then let's just look at commuting time, which if you don't have kids in school, you may not care that teachers live in your community. But if you're in North Fulton, commuting time, traffic is something that hits every one of us. In 2016, 14% of the jobs inside the 6 North Fulton cities, and we use 6 cities, were filled by people who lived in that city. They lived close to their jobs. In 2021, that percentage was cut in half. Just 7% of the people that work in North Fulton cities actually live there. Everybody else drives from outside that area.
And we see that in the numbers of available housing options. There are currently no single-family homes or apartments in that middle-income family affordability range in North Fulton.
And that brings us to get the chance to talk with Kyle Wingfield, who is the president and CEO of the Georgia Public Policy Foundation, which is a Georgia think tank. It conducts research, but I won't tell us about it. We'll let Kyle do it. Thanks for joining us, Kyle.
Thank you, Jack and Nancy, and it's great to be here with y'all this morning. The Georgia Public Policy Foundation, since 1991, has been an independent resource, trustworthy resource for voters, for elected officials throughout the state of Georgia. We look at really important problems for people and bring actionable solutions to those problems. And we do that through research. We publish a lot of information on a lot of topics, housing affordability being a key topic for us the last few years. We hold events, we go down to the Capitol and talk to lawmakers about solutions that would work for the problems that they're looking at, and really just try to improve the lives of Georgians through public policies that enhance economic opportunity and freedom.
Great. You and I first met at least 20 years ago. You've done some interesting things since then. Tell us a little bit about those, please.
Yeah, 20 plus years ago, when you were working with my wife down at the Metro Atlanta Chamber, I was working for the Associated Press at that time over in Montgomery, Alabama, and went from there to write editorials for the Wall Street Journal based in Brussels, Belgium. We went there as newlyweds and came back as new parents and moved back to Atlanta for an opportunity where I got to be an opinion columnist for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution for 9 years, which was a lot of fun, and got to write about a lot of really great stories and things going on over the years. And then about 6.5 years ago, I left the AJC to come to the Georgia Public Policy Foundation.
I can tell you I never missed your column.
Well, thank you.
Had to make sure I read it. And today we're recording this on Election Day. And we've been through an interesting election and come out of it with, apparently, according to polls, no winner. But we'll see. But you wrote a piece in one of your newsletters some time ago that we need to disagree better. And coming out of this election, we may still be disagreeing. So tell us a little bit about what your thinking is there and how do we do that?
Yeah, it's a line that I borrowed from a man named Arthur Brooks, who used to run the American Enterprise Institute and is a columnist and has been a professor and a researcher and is really in the field of happiness, of all things, what makes people happy and that kind of thing. And his argument, which I was expounding on in the piece that you read, is that people talk about, we need to come together, we need to agree, we need to find common ground. And he said, look, that's not necessarily correct. Yeah, it'd be great if people agreed about more things, but the likelihood of that happening isn't terribly high right now. As you point out, we're coming out of an election. A lot of people are worried about what's going to come after the election. Because somebody's going to win and somebody's going to lose, however long it takes us to count the votes. He said, our real problem is that we're not good at disagreeing, and by that he means we don't marshal facts the way that you did at the top of this show, talking about here's an issue and here's the reason we're talking about that issue, right? And listening to people who disagree and adjusting our arguments based on what we hear from them. And it's really easy in the news media world that we have, in the social media world that we have, in the grouping with other people in person and socially with people who agree with us, to only ever encounter people who agree with us or only ever read things that affirm what we already believe. And that's what's gotten us into this. I think Arthur would argue, and I was arguing as well. And in the piece, I talked about a situation where I ended up in an unexpected conversation where two people in the group just had really opposite opinions about a particular topic, which in this case was the role of the federal government in our K-12 education. And the conversation really was great because everybody was being very careful to be respectful toward one another, and it was sharpening their arguments. You could see it happening in real time. People were, one person would hear what the other one had to say and say, have you considered this? And it was making each of them better at arguing their own position, and at the same time allowing them to understand where the other one was coming from and move a little bit. Neither of them changed their overall opinion by the end of this conversation, but they understood better, I think, why someone might not share that opinion. And that's really the bottom line of that piece that I wrote and the work that Arthur Brooks has done, just saying we don't all have to agree but we need to get better at how we engage with one another when we disagree.
You've already taught me something. I don't use, have you considered this? I'm much more into my next argument, so that's helpful.
Well, and as you were talking, all I was thinking of was respect. If you can respect that somebody might have a different argument, you can go a long way to having that conversation. And so we're data nerds. That's our foundation.
My people. Yeah. They're good.
And I think because you were talking about housing earlier than a lot of folks, I'm interested. I know you had a conversation with a well-known politician that kind of led you to some of this. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, during my time at the AJC, I got to know the late Senator Johnny Isaacson fairly well, and just always enjoyed spending time with him. He was someone who was really good at disagreeing. He had his beliefs, but he made a point of learning what other people believed and using that to get to a solution. The dirty word we call compromise sometimes. And so I was visiting him. This turned out to be, unfortunately, toward the end of his time in the Senate. He had the incident following that led to him needing to resign very shortly after this. But I was telling him that this was an issue that the foundation was looking at working on soon, because I knew that was his industry, right? He came out of the housing industry. And true to form, his mind was just amazingly sharp to the very end. And he rattled off a decades-long history of everything that the federal government in particular had done to make housing more affordable, mostly on the lending side, on the financing side. And he said, but one thing that doesn't get enough attention is what government does to make the problem worse in the first place. He said, I once personally calculated how much did government fees, taxes, regulations, requirements, delays, all the ways that government touches the home building process. How much did that cost? And he said, I calculated that it was 37% of the cost for us to build a new home. And I'm listening to him saying that, and that just floored me, that more than a third of the cost of this very important task would be that. So after that conversation, I started asking people in the industry. Someone told me that this is how much government contributes to your cost. And people would say, I don't know, it's probably about a third, or maybe 30% or 27, 28%. No one ever said, no, it's 10%. It's not a problem. No one ever said that. Every answer I got was, yeah, it's a problem. If it's not 37, it's close to that. So at the same time, I was hearing people on the building side talk about the difficulty of making these more affordable projects pencil out, make the numbers work. And the gap that I kept hearing was you can get within about 10% of making these projects pencil out, and that's what we're trying to come up with. Now, I'm just a simple journalist at heart, right? Numbers are not why anyone gets into journalism. Maybe it's why they get out of other fields into journalism to stay away from math and numbers. But if the government's creating a cost that's 25, 30, 35%, and 10% is what we can't come up with on the financing side, I think, why don't we just reduce that government cost by those 10 percentage points or close to it, and voila, we'll have solved our problem. Simplistic way of thinking about it, but I think it's a really important way to think about it. And we went from there and decided we probably need a harder number than just what we're getting anecdotally. And we set out, our first foray into this was to try to establish that number.
And you've got some data on the different areas of North Fulton and how much their impact is, right?
I do. So our first study on this issue of housing affordability, which we published in I think it was January of 20, was the cost of regulation in building a single family home in Georgia. Now, this was patterned after a national study that the National Association of Home Builders does about every 5 years. They survey their members and about different costs, different ways that government influences the cost of building a new single-family home. And so we set out to get a number for Georgia for that. So we wanted a comparable number to the national figure. So we used their questions with their permission. We used their questions, their methodology exactly. And we sent the survey to hundreds of builders in Georgia and got dozens and dozens of responses. And the number that they came back with was that it was almost 27% of the cost of building a new single family home comes from some sort of government regulation. Now, this doesn't include like fees necessarily, that sort of thing. And that breaks down to 11.3% during the development of the lot and 15.6% during the actual construction of the house. Really importantly, and why this study has gotten a lot of attention from policymakers, the national figure was about 24%. So we're 3 percentage points higher. Now, what does Georgia like to pride ourselves on? That we're a great state to do business in, right? That our government lets the market work and solve problems. So people in Georgia don't really like hearing that in this very important area that we're all suddenly focused on, that we're actually doing worse than the national average, that we're not friendly to the building industry, and that maybe that's part of the problem. And so it's got a lot of attention. A lot of people started a lot of conversations that I think ultimately are moving the issue along in our state.
So where do you think there's room to change that? I know some are safety, some are accessibility, where do you start to reframe that?
The first thing we say is that the right answer is not zero. We're not saying that none of this should be happening. We're not saying that it's all bad. It comes from lots of different areas. In fact, there's 11 different areas that we asked about. And I tell people, especially when I speak with local policymakers, because the survey doesn't ask people to distinguish between federal, state, and local regulation. But the truth is that most of this happens at the local level. When I talk to local policymakers, I say, look, this happened bit by bit over time. No one set out to make building more onerous than it needs to be. Every little thing that contributed to this, 0.5% here and a 1% there, happened because somebody thought it was a good idea at the time to do something. And what they didn't realize is that they were adding up. There were lots of other people doing the same thing, and that it all adds up. So, for instance, the largest single item here is changes to the building codes over the past 10 years. And it's phrased that way to try to get away from things that are long since baked in to deal with health and safety, right? We're trying to not count that and just take that as a given and say, how is it changing recently? And in a lot of cases, these are green energy or other environmental types of regulations that have gone into that. So again, maybe some of that is justifiable. Should it be 7% of the cost of a new home? What if it were 5%? That's still keeping the bulk of it or finding a way to accomplish some of these goals, but finding a way to make it more efficient. And then the next largest single item here, and this is where I think a lot of the conversation needs to go, is to architectural design standards beyond the ordinary. So those are your requirements that if you're going to build a house in our community, it needs to be 4-sided brick. If you're going to build a house in our community, it has to have dug footings, not built on a slab. And most of the time, aside from the question of whether everyone's architectural or aesthetic sensibilities are the same across an entire community, what looks good to one person is not necessarily what looks good to someone else, is most of these things just chiefly function to drive up the cost of building a new home. And sometimes you wonder if maybe that's the point.
How do we, in North Fulton, how does that show up comparatively to other regions?
For that particular study, I'm not able to answer that specifically because we did a statewide number. That 26.9% that we came up with is a statewide figure. We're hoping to repeat that study in another year or two and get a large enough sample size, especially on a regional basis, we may not be able to say North Fulton or even Fulton County, but Metro Atlanta. What is it in Metro Atlanta? Look, if we got enough responses, North Metro versus South Metro, that'd be even better. We'd love to publish something that granular. It takes a lot of responses to get the sample size large enough to be able to credibly report that. But yeah, we aren't able to say that. We have done some other work looking at things like lot size minimums and home size minimums and development impact fees, where we have looked at that on a local basis. And for instance, on the lot size minimums, and the caveat here is that this is measuring any part of a jurisdiction. It doesn't necessarily cover the entire jurisdiction. So I hope your audience won't call you up and say, this doesn't apply in my neighborhood. Yeah, I'm acknowledging at the start that it may not apply in your neighborhood, but there are parts of each of these jurisdictions where these minimums do apply. And so you have to have a lot at least this size. And it varies really. In Roswell, the largest, or the most restrictive, I should say, lot size minimum that we found within the city of Roswell was a lot size of 18,000 square feet. You compare that with Alpharetta, where it's over 43,000 square feet, or Milton, where it's over 87,000 square feet. So just that comparison right there, there are areas of these cities where they're necessarily restricting the number of homes that can go in because they're requiring each home to go on a larger lot. We also see this with home size minimums. Now, not every city has one of these. For instance, we didn't find one in Roswell or in Alpharetta, but in Milton, there was the most restrictive area of Milton had a home size minimum of 2,000 square feet. Now, you think about the starter home, the typical, I know a legislator who likes to talk about entry-level housing. How are you getting on to the ladder of housing that hopefully you move up as your needs dictate? 2,000 square feet is twice as large probably as a lot of us think of a typical starter home, right? So there are areas, and it's not just in Fulton County, you see this across the state. There are areas where you're basically outlawing building new homes that are accessible at the types of income levels that y'all are looking at.
Yeah, it made me think about my first home in North Carolina was 1,100 square feet. And we were comfortable, and we could afford it.
And there are plenty of homes in these communities, at least some of them, that exist today. You just couldn't build that home now. And that's, I think, a really something that people need to grapple with. If it's somehow substandard, why are we allowing it to exist if it's already built? And if it works for people where it's already built, why are we not allowing it to be built there? You come to the conclusion pretty quickly that it's to maintain a certain type or cost of home in the community.
And this may be, certainly you would have an opinion of it. What's driving that? What's driving that, trying to maintain these standards? Is it just decorative, or is there more to it?
It's really hard to answer with a lot of certainty. I can certainly speculate, and I will. Look, I think there's a lot of things going on here. One is this region, broadly speaking, has experienced a tremendous amount of growth over the last few decades. The state of Georgia, since 1980, I believe it is, has added at least 1 million people per decade. Every census, our population is at least 1 million larger than it was the time before. The vast majority of that growth is coming to Metro Atlanta. A lot of that has been focused on places like North Fulton over the years. So some of it is probably some growth fatigue and some kind of wariness about how much more is our community going to change. We've absorbed a lot of change, not just in the number of people coming, but how that changes the landscape of our community, the physical infrastructure of our community. In many cases, like the physical infrastructure, the roads that haven't kept up, right? So you get to the traffic problem that you alluded to earlier. And so there's a lot of things that come along with that growth that I think people start to just say, okay, all right, we've had enough. So there's an element of that. You hear a lot about, we don't want to change the character of our community. I don't necessarily know what that means, but as you've seen a move outward from the city of Atlanta into the suburbs of lower income people, I think that's some of what they're talking about. They look at their schools and they like how well their public schools perform. We know there's a correlation between family income and school performance. And even if you give people credit for having the best of intentions and saying we want to keep our schools highly performing, there's some of that. So when I look at these regulations where you seem to be intentionally making it more expensive to build new housing, then you're at least implicitly saying we only want people earning a certain amount of money to live here. And so when you look at those median income type households that y'all are focused on, those are the ones who are missing out. And I think what people forget is that people's incomes aren't static, right? Just because they move to a community making less than that figure doesn't mean they're always going to. It doesn't. There's people change, and our political debate certainly gets this wrong a lot of times. There's no movement and no mobility. There's maybe less than there could be or should be, but there's still plenty. And so I think people are really missing out on that key feature. Think about your own life, right? You didn't make as much when you were 25 as you did 35 or 45 in most cases. Thinking about it from a very static view like that, I think is probably a mistake.
So you were talking, and we were talking about housing and affordability pre-pandemic, certainly. And at that point, we were explaining the issue to North Fulton folks in different groups, and we were talking about essential workers and explaining what those were. We don't have to do that post-pandemic, but it does seem like there's a positive in that there seems to be some more recognition about the need for more affordable housing. Have you seen progress in that area?
Yes and no. Certainly, as you said, the conversation has changed. I think people are acknowledging that we've been getting something wrong, right? And we'll even talk with a lot of policymakers who will say, yep, I hear you. I get it. My constituents, on the other hand, disagree, to put it mildly, right? There's a little bit of some other community needs to fix this problem attitude that we see, certainly not just here in North Fulton or Metro Atlanta. We see this down near Savannah, where the new Hyundai plant has just opened, and you've got between that plant and the suppliers nearby and existing industry that needs more workers, tens of thousands of people moving to that area, and yet you've got the jurisdictions closest to that factory trying to slow down and prevent growth and hope that the next county over will accept it. And then that county, guess what they do? They think the same thing. And suddenly you're talking about, well, maybe they'll go live in this other place that's 50 miles away. And one, you're not going to attract the workforce that's needed if the answer is there's plenty of housing 50 miles from here, right? That's not really going to work. But two, you're creating all sorts of other problems, right? You're creating stress on your road infrastructure. You're creating traffic problems. I think you're even, as we look at population trends and demographic trends and the aging of our population, we're already going to see fewer and fewer school-aged children coming up, and we're offsetting a lot of our natural demographic decline by having lots of people move to Georgia. But the trend is still the trend, and you're still going to have fewer K through 12 students 5 years from now, or 10 years from now than you do today. Then if you exacerbate that problem when you make it impossible or economically infeasible for people of that age, with that age children who tend to be younger, earlier in their careers, making less money. If they can't move into your community because there's no housing for them, they're not bringing their children with them. And those schools that you think you're protecting, you may actually be undermining. And I think we're starting to see that in some places where you see elementary school populations falling. And I know in North Fulton, there's some big debate about the closure or the planned or proposed closure of an elementary school. And we're only going to see more of that as the demographic change happens. And then again, if you're making it harder and harder for people to move to your community who are more likely to have students that age, it's just going to be an even sharper decline. And there's going to be a lot of angst in the other direction, I think, about not allowing people in.
And I think even in the short term, it's certainly a short-sighted view. I remember during the last council elections, I asked a number of the candidates about workforce housing. And at the time, they said, we have workforce housing. It's in Forsyth County. Guess what? There's jobs for teachers and public safety officers and nurses in Forsyth County. And what may have attracted them here was the job they had in Alpharetta. But eventually they're going to say, I'm not doing this commute, or I'm having kids, and the child care is an issue, so I've got to stay up close to where they are.
And by the way, in Forsyth County, they're having the same conversations
Right.
in terms of policies, right? So now you're talking about Dawson County. Is a teacher going to drive from Dawsonville to North Fulton at 6 a.m. to arrive in time for all of his or her duties? You're just creating a host of problems.
And that's part one of our interview with Kyle Wingfield of the Georgia Public Policy Foundation. On behalf of Jack Murphy and Nancy Diamond of the North Fulton Improvement Network, I want to thank Kyle again so much for offering such an insightful interview, so much so that we left the mics on and kept going and created 2 parts. Join us in a month or so for the next installment of this interview, part 2 of this interview with Kyle Wingfield. I also want to remind you that North Fulton Voices is presented by the North Fulton Improvement Network. North Fulton Voices is the go-to source for in-depth analysis and discussion of the missing middle housing crisis in our region and the livability challenges that this crisis causes. Listen as we understand the implications of the issues, explore innovative solutions, and examine why housing solutions like the ones we have discussed on this show are vital for North Fulton's future. You can subscribe on your favorite podcast app, such as Apple, Spotify. We're on all the major podcast apps, and this show is sponsored and offered as a service to the community by yours truly, John Ray, and the North Fulton affiliate of Business RadioX. For Nancy Diamond and Jack Murphy, join us next time on North Fulton Voices.
Thank you for joining us on North Fulton Voices. This show is presented by the North Fulton Improvement Network, working to solve our community's workforce housing challenges. For more information, visit improvenorthfulton.org.